Have you ever stared at your own reflection and wondered, who were these people really, before someone else decided to write our story for us? Not the version from a textbook, not the sanitized, colonizer-approved summary that skipped entire civilizations to get to the part where ships arrived. The real story. The one written in your blood, in your bones, in the genetic memory that no decree or burning of manuscripts could ever fully erase. DNA doesn't lie. Colonial governors do. And right now, in laboratories across Southeast Asia, Europe, and the United States, geneticists are pulling threads from ancient Filipino remains and weaving a picture so staggering, so completely at odds with what most Filipinos were taught in school, that researchers themselves have used the word extraordinary in their published findings. Not as hyperbole, as a clinical descriptor. So let's go back, way back, because the story of the Philippines didn't start in 1565. The Austronesian expansion is one of the most remarkable human migrations ever recorded. Starting roughly 5,000 years ago, seafaring peoples pushed outward from Taiwan and the coastal regions of what is now southern China. They moved into island Southeast Asia with a sophistication that modern archaeologists are still struggling to fully quantify. The Philippines wasn't a waypoint, it was a hub, a central node in a maritime network that connected populations stretching from Madagascar in the west to Easter Island in the east. Genetic studies published in journals like Nature and Current Biology have confirmed this with extraordinary precision. The Philippine archipelago carries ancestral signatures that link it directly to this vast Pacific world, a world that was trading, navigating, and communicating across open ocean centuries before European sailors understood how to read southern stars. Stop. Think about that for a second. While medieval Europe was largely contained within its own borders, Filipino ancestors were sailing thousands of kilometers with navigational knowledge passed through generations of practice. No compass, no GPS. Pure accumulated understanding of wind, current, star position, and wave pattern. That knowledge was real. That civilization was real. And then someone decided it wasn't worth mentioning in the curriculum. The pre-colonial Philippine world had writing systems, plural. The Baybayin script, which most Filipinos have at least heard of, was only one of them. Researchers studying indigenous scripts across the archipelago have documented regional variations: Hanunuo, Buhid, Tagbanwa, Kulitan. These weren't decorative curiosities. They were functional writing systems used for communication, commerce, and what contemporary scholars describe as a form of legal documentation. When Spanish colonial administration took hold in the 16th century, a systematic effort began to redirect literacy through the Roman alphabet and the church. The old scripts didn't disappear overnight, but the institutional support for them did. And within a few generations, most Filipinos no longer recognized what their great-grandparents had been able to read. Here's where it gets complicated and uncomfortable. All right? The colonial project in the Philippines wasn't simply military. It was administrative, cultural, and deeply strategic. The destruction of pre-colonial records was, in certain documented cases, deliberate. Friars recorded the burning of objects considered idolatrous. Indigenous manuscripts written on perishable materials, bamboo, leaves, bark, vanished partly through active suppression and partly through neglect and climate. What survived did so almost by accident. A few manuscripts preserved in European archives. Objects buried with the dead, and now locked inside the mitochondrial DNA of living Filipinos. Genetic archaeology has become the unexpected archivist. Researchers sampling remains from burial sites across Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao have found genetic profiles that tell a story of extraordinary complexity. These weren't isolated island populations developing in a vacuum. The data shows clear evidence of contact and exchange with populations from Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and mainland Southeast Asia going back millennia. Trade networks, intermarriage, cultural transmission. A living, breathing, interconnected world that had no need of outside validation to know it was sophisticated. Truly sophisticated. On the other hand, the gold work alone should have made this obvious. Moving on, the Golden Tara of Agusan. The artifacts recovered from various archaeological sites across the archipelago. Filipino goldsmithing before colonization was not primitive craft. Researchers who have studied surviving pieces describe technical complexity, granulation, filigree, lost wax casting, that required generations of specialized skill to develop. The Philippines had its own artistic tradition so developed that some of its surviving objects are now held in international museum collections, not because they were given away, because many were taken. If you want to understand exactly how deep this removal went and why DNA evidence is now forcing a complete reevaluation of the standard historical narrative, stay with this video. What comes next will reframe everything you thought you understood about where Filipino identity actually begins. Moving on, the pre-colonial Philippine political structure is another area where the textbook version is thin to the point of being misleading. The barangay system, which most Filipinos learn about as a simple village unit, was, in reality, the visible tip of a far more layered political organization. Datus operated within networks of alliance and obligation that functioned like a decentralized federal structure. Certain polities in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago maintained connections to the broader Islamic world through trade and political marriage. The Sultanate of Sulu had diplomatic correspondence with China. The Manila area before 1571 was a fortified Muslim settlement called Manila, with its own governance, its own trade relationships, and its own place in a regional political ecosystem. This wasn't a collection of scattered fishing villages waiting for civilization to arrive. This was a functioning society. Wait, then what actually happened to all of it? Now pay attention. The short answer is the paper trail was disrupted, but the biological record was not. That's the thing about DNA. You can't burn a chromosome. You can suppress a language, rename a landscape, replace a religious system. You cannot edit the mitochondrial inheritance that passes from mother to child across centuries without interruption. And what that biological record shows consistently across multiple independent studies is a population with deep roots, complex origins, and a history that extends far beyond the colonial encounter. Recent genomic research has also begun to illuminate the Negrito populations of the Philippines in new ways. Groups like the Eta and the Agta carry genetic signatures that represent some of the earliest human habitation in the archipelago, possibly among the earliest in Southeast Asia. These populations existed in the islands for tens of thousands of years before the Austronesian migrations. The standard school narrative, when it touches on them at all, tends to treat them as footnotes. Genetic science is now making a forceful argument that they are, in fact, among the deepest roots of the entire human story in the region. 3 words: deepest, human, roots. And yet, for generations, Filipino students sat in classrooms and learned a history that began with Magellan's arrival in 1521. Not because nothing existed before, but because the educational architecture built during colonial administration was designed to make the pre-colonial past seem thin, fragmented, and ultimately less legitimate than what replaced it. That's not speculation. Historians of education have documented this pattern across colonized societies globally. The curriculum was a tool, a very effective one. Here's the other side of this story, because there's always another side. In contrast to the colonial era suppression, look at what has happened in the last 3 decades as Filipino historians, archaeologists, and geneticists have begun to reclaim the narrative from the inside. The work being done at the Philippine National Museum, the ongoing excavations at the Calao Cave site in Cagayan, where remains have been dated by researchers to roughly 67,000 years ago, pushing back the timeline of human habitation in the Philippines dramatically. The collaborative genomic studies involving Filipino researchers working alongside international teams. This is a different model entirely, not waiting for validation from outside institutions, building the evidence from primary sources from the ground up. The contrast is almost violent in its clarity. One approach: remove the records, replace the framework, control the story. Another approach: dig into the earth, sequence the genome, publish the findings, and let the data speak for itself. The second approach is winning, not because of politics, because of evidence. Think about it. The Laguna copperplate inscription is a perfect illustration of this. Dated to 900 CE, written in an early Kawi script with Sanskrit and Malay elements, it's the oldest known written document found in the Philippines. It describes a legal transaction involving a debt settlement. It references place names, social ranks, and a level of administrative formality that implies an existing literate culture with legal conventions. This object existed. It was found. It was translated, and it completely dismantled the idea that Philippine society before colonization was pre-literate or administratively primitive. A single copperplate did that. Imagine what's still in the ground. On the other hand, the DNA findings now add a biological layer to what the copperplate suggested textually. The populations described in that inscription didn't appear from nowhere. They were the product of thousands of years of migration, settlement, intermarriage, cultural development, and regional connection. The genes confirm what the document implies. So what do you do with all of this right now? Pull up the Laguna copperplate inscription and read the translation for yourself. It takes 4 minutes and will permanently change how you think about Filipino literacy. Look up the published genomic studies from the Philippine Genome Center and read the summary sections. Visit the National Museum of the Philippines website and look at the Pre-Colonial Gold collection. Well, these aren't hidden. They're just not on the standard reading list. Send this video to one person, a family member, a classmate, anyone who still believes the Philippines had no meaningful history before 1521. Don't argue with them, just send them the primary sources. Let the Laguna copperplate do the talking. Let the genomic data do the talking. Because here's what 67,000 years of human presence in these islands means. Filipino identity is not a colonial construction. It was already fully formed, layered, complex, documented in copper and bone and blood long before any foreign flag was planted in the ground. The history was never erased, only buried. And now, one chromosome at a time, it's coming back up. Truly coming.